And we're live. And I'm sorry for the scatterbrain. I don't have like my apps don't sync well. I don't even have my email connected to my smartphone. That's how
Okay.
like unorganized I am. I check my email like one to two times a day usually, and so I'm trying to learn how to be offline more. And
Mm.
I guess my memory is failing me. So my apologies. I appreciate you still it's taking my invitation. So you are Alexander. Your internet handle. Let me look at this. Is it your internet handle for everything, or is it just for Twitter?
Uh, it's for everything except Instagram,
All right,
because
Alex CZ. Is that fair to say?
KCZ, yeah, KCZ, yeah. Because the problem with being called Alex is that there's like a billion Alexes in the world, so it's always taken.
Okay.
Whereas like that, it's never taken.
So let me. So like I have a very basic YouTube channel. Most of it is me just live streaming, me writing code, but I also
Yeah.
have a mastermind that I do every Friday in the
Mm.
morning. So it's more for me to document my journey than anything else.
Mm.
But let me tell you how I discovered you. I've
Okay.
always and there's a comment coming in, so hopefully I don't get out of I don't lose my context. But all right, I found you because I think I was searching YouTube maybe 3 months ago,
Mm.
and I've always been interested in Clojure, but I've as a .NET developer, it's a complete paradigm shift. Like the whole ecosystem is, I think, different. And
Mm.
I remember watching a talk that you gave at a conference, and one you obviously stood out, right? Just based on like I'm not used to you stood out based on your physical
Mm.
features, right? So it
Mm.
made it interesting. And then as I was listening, I thought I'm not sure which talk it was because more than likely you sound pretty comfortable giving talks, so you probably gave a couple of them. But I believe you were describing the journey to
Yeah.
to uh, to learning Clojure and applying it.
Mm.
And I just wanted to reach out to you because I purchased a book on Clojure like maybe 4 months ago,
Mm.
but I still haven't like gone like balls deep into it. And so
Mm.
I'm an F sharp. I choose F sharp for development, regardless of if companies like it or not. I still just write F
Mm.
sharp, and they just have to maintain it.
Yeah.
But Clojure is interesting because I've never outside of F sharp, the F sharp community, I've never seen people or observed people so gun ho about the Clojure paradigm, and
Mm.
I feel as if Clojure is completely different from all the other languages on the JVM because
Mm.
it's a Lisp, it's dynamic, and there's like this hard drum that everybody beats to in regards to the REPL, and somehow the REPL is like my understanding the way people preach it is like the core of people's development workflow in regards to continuous or iterative feedback. And I'm not really familiar with that paradigm. I try to use the REPL in F sharp, and it doesn't really work well for me.
Mm.
And so I was just curious, like, what what drew you to Clojure? What was the journey like? And I know this is kind of overloaded, but
Mm.
towards the end, um, is can Clojure really be applied to large scale development, both for a code base and distributed teams, or is it meant is it tailored towards uh, like small repositories or small services? Like, does it scale well? Is
Yeah.
my question. So just
Okay.
this is kind of like a free flowing conversation,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm just picking your brain, and we could go anywhere. It doesn't have to be
Okay.
on topic.
So I think yeah. So I'm glad you watched the video. It's always nice to get feedback. So okay, I don't work in a massive dev team, right? So I can't necessarily give you like personal experience of writing Clojure in a distributed team. But what I've realized with Clojure is that initially you just switch from one language to another, so it's the same code, just written in a different syntax. But as you mature in the language, the lines of code you write actually reduces because it has many of the features that you normally spend time in other languages writing. Like things like sorting and checking for null and those things normally, like in JavaScript, for example, because I also write JavaScript quite a bit of it. A lot of the code is checking for errors and converting things and transforming things, and Clojure does that really well out of the box. So immediately all that code is gone. So your lines of code really, really reduces.
Are you referring to what appears to be the default data structure of using maps?
Yeah, so if you're using maps, I mean, maps inherently have like a type checking mechanism. So if you ask for a property that's not there, it returns your program doesn't crash. So you don't have to write any of that kind of stuff. Right? So which it originally eliminates a lot of code that you'd otherwise write. So for that reason, and a few others, Clojure code is generally shorter. And because it's shorter, it's a lot more easy to maintain. Right? So that's what I find really nice about it. And the other thing that I find, so being truthful here, when I started, I was not about the REPL. It seemed like way too much drama. Let me just write my code in VS Code, hit compile, everyone's happy. Right? So that was kind of what my workflow was like. But once I became more comfortable with the language, um, I needed to quickly see if something would work. So, okay, I have this problem and this is the data. I want to transform it like this and then run an operation on it. So what I'll do is I'd open the REPL and then I make let's say it's a map. I'd make like a demo map and then just try a string of commands to see if it transforms the map the way I intend. And then when it does, I just copy that code into my editor and I'm good to go. And because everything is function based, if the function works in the REPL, it's literally the same function. I just put it into my editor and I'm good to go. So I don't think I'm on like top level tier of using the REPL, but I find it's really useful for developing because I can try out my ideas. Because what I found is that when you're developing in context and solving an actual problem, it's sometimes difficult to find out, is the problem with your transform or that operation you're running, or is it something else that happened elsewhere? So with the REPL and functional programming, that's never an issue, right? Because the function gets in two things or one thing or whatever, and then you work on it there and then it spits them out.
So here's the part that is probably going to be the reason why I can't convert 100% to the Clojure paradigm is I'm addicted to strong types. And so the latest methodology that I use for building software is I'll identify like a subdomain of the system and identify the core operations that the system is going to rely on. And then basically identifying the verbs, right? The core operations of that subdomain. And then with those verbs, I say, okay, in order for these core operations for this particular domain to be successful, what do they require as parameters or as arguments? And then that identifies my data types, right? My nouns. And so basically identifying the core operations as function types ultimately expose or flesh out the actual data structures that I need for those operations to be successful. And so when I do that, I pretty much am guaranteed, for the most part, especially while still maintaining a functional paradigm, that if it compiles and it returns a rich type, then it's going to work at a modular level. It may not work out at runtime dealing with integration, but it's going to work. The reason why I mentioned all that is because I have a heavy reliance on types to develop confidence, and it somewhat alleviates me from writing as many unit tests as I used to write. In Clojure, my understanding is there's no like rich type system, but that's not an issue for Clojure developers. They still have confidence in their code. And that's the part that kind of like boggles my mind of, okay, so you have a REPL, but when you start having these heavy data structure values, that are composites of composites of composites, how easy is it for you to really start using the REPL then, especially when you have dependencies on other modules within your solution? And so that's the
I'm
part
with you.
that I'm curious
Yeah.
about. Or
So
because it's a different paradigm, there's a certain way of programming where that's not even the issue.
yeah, so I think, and that's it. It's not immediately apparent, and I guess many people don't speak about that part because they passed it years ago. But what happens when you start is that you write stuff functional, but lots of things happen in that function. You transform this, you transform that, you subtract this, you do this and that, and you make a call there, and then you spit an output. So many things happen, and because of that, the types are actually important to almost track where you are in the process. But as you write more and more code in Clojure, those functions actually get split up very often, so that there's actually fewer functions. Well, sorry, there's more functions doing very specific things. So types is no longer an issue. The types becomes an issue when stuff is actually coming into your program. So for example, I work a lot with Firebase, and so it means that I use the Google Java SDK, and that's obviously typed. And then I'm type hinting things and worrying about types all the time. So when I first started integrating, I had a lot of type hints and type checking everywhere. Right, and I was getting all those errors about it's the wrong type and doesn't exist. But over time, what I found is that would happen in one place when I interact with the endpoint or interact with the library. But everything else actually doesn't have to worry about types. Right, so I think it's just that when that shift happens, you're heavily reliant on types. But as you become more confident in the language as a whole, that reliance really fades away.
Okay, so here's the question. When I'm the type of dude where I go to Cancun all the time. I could go anywhere in the world, but I go to Cancun. Like that's my happy place, right? The reason I mention that is because once I like something, once I have a pleasant experience,
Mm-hmm.
I don't explore any alternatives. I'm already sold, right? My question is Clojure obviously it's a general purpose programming language, but my question is Clojure the end all for you? Do you can you
No,
really
it's
can
not.
you really
It's
apply
not.
Clojure as a general purpose language for building business applications, or are you still somewhat pragmatic in which Clojure is in your toolbox, and for whatever reason you would use Scala or Java or
No. Okay.
whatever as an alternative?
So okay, I get you. So I'm also very much like I'm set in my ways. You know, I've drank the same apple juice for the last 15 years and haven't tried any other.
Okay.
So like I'm very much set in my ways. But so the part where I don't use Clojure, and I think it'll be many years if anything, if it happens at all, is in the front end. So I do a lot of JS. I do some stuff, the Angular, Vue, and I do a lot of CSS. So for me, like the whole Clojure script thing and CSS in Clojure, not convinced. So when I hit the front end, there I don't use Clojure.
Okay.
But for backend stuff, I used to do Node stuff and PHP stuff. I never really liked Java, to be honest. But
So,
over time, I've just stopped using Node completely.
all right. So let's take that. Do you have any experience with like mobile apps or anything like that?
No, not entirely. No. So I did some work in Ionic,
Okay.
and I did Android before Android Studio was a thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
The reason why I ask is like I apply F sharp, and so my UI, like the actual like code behind my XAML files, which is
Mm.
like markup for a user
Mm-hmm.
interface, that stuff is in C sharp. But then like my view models or my controllers and everything else that's on the client device,
Mm.
all that stuff is in F sharp. I'm curious if Clojure can be applied the same way, where like you may use Kotlin for your like user interface logic
Mm.
and event handlers. But then when you're dispatching those user commands from the user interface to some type of preprocessor before it hits a server, you can have the remaining back part of that mobile app implementation in Clojure.
Yeah. So
Theoretically, is the answer yeah, or
yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay.
You'd have to have something that's built on the JVM or use Clojure script. So in the Clojure script stuff I've looked at, the parts where it's just pure Clojure code. So yes, it's in JavaScript, but it's no JavaScript functions. It's really clean. It becomes messy when you're interacting with like actual JavaScript or when you're trying to render markup. And that part is like I still find it a bit like I'm not as fluent in that as I am in HTML and CSS.
Okay.
And then for me to build like HTML, CSS, and then have Clojure script is like a bit of a chore at the moment. So I haven't gone down that road. But Clojure definitely. I mean, the Clojure, if your Clojure code doesn't use any platform specific stuff, you can actually write it so that it's agnostic to whether it's on Clojure script or on the JVM. So you can actually pass that code between your client and your server. They can actually share the same library, to be honest.
And how often do you think that actually happens in practice?
Well, if you're a strong Clojure shop, yes. If you're a small shop like me, it's easier just to do it in HTML and JS. Because also, I mean, there isn't nowadays with Vue.js, it's really simple to manage state.
So here's my next question, and this dude Roman or Raman, he's been pretty active, and he could ask a question. Feel free. But my question, if he's preparing one, my question is, naturally my phone's ringing, which I didn't expect, is okay, with Scala, my understanding is it doesn't have strong opinions, or it's not strong enough. So therefore, there's multiple ways of solving a specific problem, a small problem in Scala, meaning that it doesn't really my understanding is it doesn't really constrain you, the compiler for it doesn't really constrain you to use a specific Scala way, right? If you understand what I'm trying to articulate, does Clojure have a strong opinion about its constraints in how you solve problems?
No, so it doesn't. So what you might see if you read Clojure literature, you'll see the term idiomatic closure.
Okay.
Right. So that often refers to it's like the Clojure way to do things. So the compiler doesn't enforce it, and that's what kind of makes it difficult for people to get into Clojure, because if you don't know the idioms, when you read someone else's code, it might not be apparent what's happening. So a classic example is when you're checking for if something is not empty, right? So what I would generally do is write not and then empty, right? So one argument checks it's empty, and then I invert that, and then I know it's not empty. But Clojure, you can use some, right? Like SOME, and it tells you if the thing is empty or not. So, or is it some? No, it's not some. It's sec. So it's SEQ. So check if it's a sequence. So that's what you use, and someone who is not familiar with idioms wouldn't understand why that's there. It's not clear what that's actually doing. But if you use a linter, it would say don't use not. It will say don't use not empty, rather use sec, because it's a preferred idiom.
Okay.
So it has those kind of things, but it's very possible for you to do things anyway, and the compiler won't get in the way. So you can do things. The thing that ends up happening is, as you become more experienced, you gravitate towards the idioms because it's what you see in a lot of solutions, and also because it better leverages the inherent nature of the language. Okay. So what I see that it can actually be a barrier to entry, because it does require some understanding of how those functions behave internally. Whereas not empty is super clear. Not it's empty and then it's not empty. Okay, awesome. That's very clear to anybody. Whereas sec is a bit more, I guess, hidden. Yeah, but in terms of opinionated, I think one of the big complaints about Clojure is that it's not opinionated enough. And so when you're starting out, it's a big barrier because you don't ever know if you're doing things the right way. Yeah.
So here's a question, right? Because I really care about this, and I kind of asked it, but I'll ask it in a different version. Would you write a missile defense system in Clojure?
Yes. Oh, not either than anything else. Like,
Okay.
yeah, the thing is with Clojure, I know that if my tests pass and I have good coverage, that I want to have no problems. That's
Now,
something I'm like really
is
comfortable with.
is TDD common in Clojure, or are you referring to your own personal development practice?
Well, to be honest, I did not have a TDD practice until I started working in Clojure. But by default, like all scaffolding things give you a test repository, like a test folder and a source folder. So
Okay.
it almost becomes like natural for you to write the tests. And I often write libraries as opposed to apps. So with a library, I mean, the only way you can really see if your stuff's working is by writing, a suite of tests for it. So because of that, I became more into TDD. And then once I discovered code coverage, like it was amazing because now I can write my code. The test
And,
passed, I check the coverage, then I say okay.
and now people hate you.
But the one thing I found is when I first started writing Clojure, I wrote these tests that like I had all these examples. Like I have like I have like 100 assertions in my test cases. Whereas if you look at like the more experienced Clojure developers, you like run this huge libraries depending on like millions of people and sort of like 30 assertions.
Mm.
Um, but once you've got code coverage, you can actually see that your assertion is actually covering a lot of the scenarios, and then you don't actually have to add so many. And one thing I'm super excited about now that I'm actually started using, there's this library called Malli. It's by the guys in Finland, and what it does is it's a lot easier than Clojure spec, but you can generate random data. So you can create a registry expression or specify some sort of types, and it generates the data in that form. So now when I write my tests, I just say, give me 100 objects that match the schema and run them through my tests, and afterwards see if you got the same objects out. Then I'm like, awesome, it's working.
Is that similar to property-based testing?
Um,
Or are you familiar with property-based
no,
testing?
I'm not familiar with property-based testing.
Yeah, property-based testing is you're testing your assumptions about a function. So this function will always return a positive integer or a positive float, or this function will never return empty elements. This
Yeah,
it will auto generate. It's based off of quick check in Haskell, but there's Scala check, there's FS check. There's a whole
yeah,
bunch of different
yeah,
implementations per language, but you're able to run whatever your machine can handle. You can do 100,000, a million, 10 million,
yeah,
whatever, and it will auto generate. It's essentially a data generator as a
yeah,
library, and
yeah.
it will.
It's exactly that. Yeah,
Yeah, and then you can use that, and it finds edge cases for you based on your
yeah.
assumptions, and then you can take that edge case, write a unit test, and basically make that unit test part of your regression tests.
Mm.
So
So I found that helped me a lot. So with generative tests and code coverage, now like I'm very confident in my Clojure code, more than I ever was with Node, and definitely more than ever with PHP. So yeah, so definitely if I had to write missile defense system, actually Clojure is the way.
okay,
Yeah.
ignoring the speed part that a missile defense system would require, right?
Well,
And
I mean, so with some of the new libraries that come out, there's one thing called Neanderthal. I mean, it gives you GPU access, and it can do linear algebra on the GPU level. So if you want speed, I mean, you're good to go over there. And I imagine missile defense means that's a lot of algebra.
well, okay, stupid question. I think I know the answer. Go ahead and correct me if you know the answer.
Hmm?
Is Clojure is a Lisp language. It still runs on the JVM. Technically, if it runs on the JVM, it still has to be compiled, or is it like
Mm.
just-in-time compiler?
Um, so it can run with just, I mean, with the REPL, it'll be doing just-in-time compilation.
Okay.
So I think I'm not an expert on
Yeah,
JIT,
yeah.
but it is compiled. It compiles to that executable jar file, and then that's what you run. So the time where Clojure is lags is when it starts up. So if you're
Well, hold
starting
on,
at
hold on, hold on, hold on. Let me try to better understand this, right? Before you
Mhm.
um, go in deeper. So I think .NET or I think the CLR in .NET and the JVM for the Java ecosystem, I think they're very similar, where you take your source code from the developer and then it spits out, well, in .NET it's called Microsoft Intermediate Language. In Java,
Mhm.
I thought it was called bytecode or whatever, but it's an
Mhm.
intermediary
Mhm.
language. And then just-in-time compilation takes that intermediate language and then finally converts
Yeah.
it to a whole bunch of ones and zeros or assembly or whatever.
Mhm.
Does that sound accurate? Or
Well, I
we're
would
both not
imagine.
experts, so
Um, yeah, I don't know because I don't think Java still uses bytecode and the JVM, but I'm pretty sure it's still a just-in-time compiler.
okay. Yeah, only reason
Yeah.
why I ask is how performant is Clojure compared to Java? Um,
Okay. Yeah. So I think in most cases,
because
if I'm
it
not
interacts with
mistaken,
Java, so it has to be less performant, but is it significant to care about?
so in my experience, it's not significant. The Clojure is like having it's having like sharp tools, right?
Okay.
So it helps you make the right thing quickly and effectively. Um, but the performance aspect is something that you have to actually fine tune and work on. But I think at the base level, Java can give you more performance, like in general. But
Okay.
I'd imagine that an experienced Java developer and an experienced Swift developer could end up with things that are basically almost identical in performance.
All right. So this is a question that may be frowned upon,
Mm-hmm.
right? The the behavior or the psychology of a Clojure developer in general.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the major difference between someone that applies Clojure to solve problems versus someone that uses Java or Node? Are there certain characteristics of Clojure developers in the way that they process questions or deliver solutions that is significantly different in regards to
Mm-hmm.
patterns of thinking than your mainstream Java developers?
Well,
And that may not be an answer.
yeah.
Obviously,
So I
it's
guess,
your
yeah.
opinion.
I mean, it obviously there's a huge personal element in like person specific element involved. But I would say it's almost like a bit of both. So people who write Clojure prefer simplicity and functional programming. And if you don't prefer simplicity and functional programming and you code for long in Clojure, eventually that becomes your preference. So like when I started Clojure, I was attracted to it because of the brackets. Like just being very honest, it just literally looked cool. And then over time, I found I preferred functional programming, and then I started using like Ramda for my JavaScript projects as well because I enjoyed the functional paradigm. So it's almost that by coding and coding for a long time, your preference becomes functional programming. And obviously, for those who already have that preference, it attracts them.
I once said
But
on Twitter, I've never met any F sharp developer that prefers C sharp to get work done
yeah,
ever.
and I think that's the whole thing of functional programming. Once it's bit you, there's no going back.
How long did it take for it to click? It took me. Okay, here's a brief history. Right,
Mm,
uh, I got a contract in Pennsylvania. I live in Miami, right?
mm,
But I got a contract like 2,000 miles away, and they were paying enough money that I was like, all right, I'll move out here to get this money.
mm,
And but it was in the middle of nowhere. It was a hick town. Like
mm,
I was the only black person. That's usually common wherever I go. But
mm,
anyway, so I'm like after like going to work, I was really bored. There's nothing for me to do. Like it's a huge when you live in an international city. I'm not sure where you live, but when you live in an international city where you can really do whatever you want and go
mm.
anywhere, and then you're kind of constrained to like a rural area where there's really not much to do, it kind of messes with you, especially if you're used to that lifestyle. So I'm like, all right, I'm about to try to improve myself. I'm about to learn a new language. And so I decided to learn F sharp. Um, it took me. It probably took. Really being honest with myself, it probably took about 3 years for my brain to finally click into that paradigm. Not saying that I couldn't write F sharp
Mm,
for 3 years, but it finally it took 3 years for functional programming to be like a natural way of thinking,
mm,
right? Map, filter, reduce are the building blocks for anything, right? And
mm.
so my brain finally submitted and accepted FP as its Lord and Savior after 3 years. So that's what happened to me.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds similar to my journey because in the beginning it was you're like, oh, is this actually better? Does this actually make sense? So you're not like it's almost like you're not putting your best effort in. You're still being convinced, at least for me. And then once I'm convinced, I started learning more and more and practicing more. Then it clicked. So my journey was also about 3 years.
Yeah.
But then once it clicked, like then I mean, it became really easy to reuse libraries and to understand code and to read source instead of docs. But that is like a difficulty element. There's also like a psychological barrier that I mean I saw in myself. But once that was gone, it's like Christmas now.
Do you still write Java?
No, I haven't written Java. So funnily, I actually was a lecturer in Java, and I taught object-oriented programming for quite a few years. Um, but now I only write Java if I have to. And
Do you ever struggle with trying not to present yourself as a elitist because of your firm understanding of Clojure concepts?
well, okay, just to start, I wouldn't say I have a firm understanding.
Okay.
I'd say I have a working
Of
knowledge.
your moderate understanding of
Yeah.
FP applied to the Clojure paradigm, do you ever struggle with ego and how to present yourself to? Because I mean, you're a small percentage of the Clojure community is a small percentage,
Mm,
but I would argue that they more than likely demonstrate an understanding of how to solve problems in multiple paradigms. But people might view that as kind of a elitist mentality when they're trying to share information about alternative ways of
mm,
solving problems.
mm.
Do you ever struggle with trying to maintain your I'm struggling to articulate it, but do you
Yeah,
ever
no, but
struggle to
I get what you're saying. So, so I guess the answer, at least for me, is twofold. So I do see being able to program in Clojure is definitely a privilege
okay,
because it means that you've been afforded the time to think about the problems you have and investigate alternative tools and then pick this tool, right? That's what it means because it's not a mainstream language. It means it's definitely you have had that privilege, and not everyone has that. So, um, so for me, that's it's. I always think of being able to code in Clojure as a privilege. You know, if I worked like, I mean, if you're like a dev in like a bank, you can't be like, awesome, I want to use this other language. I
yeah.
mean, that's not up to you. Very often, very little is up to you, except that little bit you have to do in that specific feature. So it's definitely a privileged position to be a Clojure developer. That said, about struggling with elitism, I mean, I don't think I've given enough talks, spoken to enough developers about Clojure for me to um, for me to I guess come across that way. I don't know, but I personally see it as it's a privilege, and people who don't code in Clojure or don't want to, don't like to. I don't think it's like a lack of ability or lack of skill thing. I think it's a lack of opportunity thing.
So here's here's the issue with me, right?
Hmm.
Is a lot of people think I'm a jerk, and sometimes I am, but I really care, and so sometimes I'm kind of hard on people. I tease them, but
Mm,
you know, we live in a society now where they get butthurt just when you're making a joke, right? That's meant to be helpful. But so I'll start teasing like C# developers, Java developers of you're using an antique language to solve problems 20 years ago, and you're trying to use it as a sledgehammer to solve problems in 2020, and I don't think that's really working out for you. And so I'll start, beating the drum on how, functional programming addresses issues just in general. Like when you write code in FP, in the FP style, FP is functional programming, then your code is inherently testable already. So regardless of if you do test-driven development or not, you can literally, in this case, using the FP paradigm, write code and have the option to test it later because it's already testable, right? And then I started talking about how you really don't have to care about concurrency and semaphores and mutexes. You don't have to care about any of that stuff that I still don't understand today. So once I start like preaching FP, I kind of come off as like a elitist, for lack of a better term, and I feel like I'm kind of discouraging people from from wanting to gravitate towards in my case the F# community because I'm kind of teasing them and making fun of them, but I just want them to consider other paradigms because I feel like I found something that is work. I know it's not the end all be all, but it works a whole lot better than what I've been using. But my personality type is I don't know how to communicate that in a soft way for a community that appears to just be soft in general, right? So that's what I meant.
Oh, yeah, no, I get what you mean, but I think it's, I mean, if your end goal is for them to have a positive developer experience, the question is how do you get them there? Maybe the first thing is not functional programming. Maybe the first step is, okay, let's write tests for all the things you're making. Once you have to write many tests for complicated code, you're going to go and change your code to make it testable. And it's almost it's like that's a journey. And so I work quite a bit with the grads at work, and one of the most discouraging things for newcomers is seeing the end and seeing the gap between where they are and that end.
Yeah.
So just because you can see the end, you don't need to tell them, okay, you need to get here. Just take the first 3 steps, work on that, and then as people become more comfortable, then you can actually take them to, okay, now that we've done all these things, let's look at the benefits of functional programming. So remember that test you had to write and you had to refactor your code because you couldn't test it. Here's a FP example. Then it's contextual and it's useful. Because very often people react negatively to these suggestions when they're not useful. Like telling someone in a Java shop who has no alternatives, use Clojure. It's like, thanks, that's not helpful. Please go away.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get you.
Well, a lot of people believe that it's not their responsibility to learn an alternative language or paradigm. It's their job's responsibility for keeping them up to date in their profession, and there's just a different way of thinking for a significant number of developers that have this sense of entitlement.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, it's something I struggled with a lot because I came from like working in like small business and startups to working in a bank, and obviously like the rate of change, the rate of things to change in a bank is like very different.
Yeah.
And initially I was just like, how is it that there's like 40,000 people here who just don't want to change? But the over time thing I realized is it's not change. It's not being adverse to change. It's the fact that they're in a complicated environment, there's a lot of risk, and to be fair, their job isn't everything. At the end of the day, whether you're the best Java developer or the second worst, maybe the thing you really love is at 4 o'clock you knock off and you go surfing with your kid. That's the actual thing you live for. So those 8 hours can just pass, and then there's always that nuance of how I feel about code is not how everyone else feels about code, and to be honest, that's okay.
What does compensation look like for Clojure developers? Yeah. It's an important question.
Yeah, it's a hyper important question. You're just asking the wrong guy.
Yeah.
Because I don't get. So what I do full time is not Clojure, as in like my salary doesn't come from a Clojure job.
Okay.
So I work as I look after like a few UX teams. So yeah, it's random, but I look after the UX team. So I'm in the UX design space. But I've got a business with my brothers where we do software dev, and that too I use Clojure. So but my clients don't care. Obviously, they just want to see the solution. Whether I write it with Node or Clojure or Java, they don't care. That's why I have the opportunity to just write Clojure. Of the jobs I've seen, Clojure seems to pay really well. But there aren't as many like Clojure jobs as there are like, let's say, Java jobs, for example. So it's always balancing that availability with remuneration. But if you can land a Clojure job, I think you're sorted. Yeah.
I'm kind of going scatterbrain. Just briefly go back. What does refactoring look like in Clojure? Because that's one of the biggest concerns that I have. Is it's not a strongly typed system. So, are there refactoring tools for Clojure? Can I, when I'm working within a 15,000 line code base, or maybe that's not even fair to say that Clojure entertains 15,000 line code bases or whatever or more. Like, can I decide to rename a function and have that cascade throughout the code base?
So yeah, so I remember I use NetBeans. I remember that feature. Right now, I stand corrected, but I don't think there is a widespread tool. But I did see someone. It's called the Clojure-LSP. Someone thought of building something to actually do that. So it's like a language server that will allow you to refactor the code. Yeah. Oh, so there's a question. I can see it on the screen. So I think just let me quickly finish the refactoring thing. So I think that's coming soon because I looked on the repo and there's no VS Code plugin, so I haven't tried it. But it seems to be on Emacs and IntelliJ and all those kind of things. So I think Clojure will have that. But that said, I've never had confidence in clicking refactor. So to me, it's like not a non-issue.
Hold up, you don't look at your code the following morning and see opportunities to find a better name for something?
No, I do.
Okay.
And then I go and look at the lines manually and change them. I don't just write refactor. I mean, like my longest code file is like 200 lines, and so it's like it doesn't take long at all.
All right, so my workflow, and again, it's probably just completely different based on technology that I choose, and the way that I model my software or my code is I have hella projects, right? Like everything I do, I usually have at least a dozen projects, and that's for something that's very basic. And so refactoring or renaming is really important to have mature tools to accommodate that for me. And so I rely heavily on domain modeling. And so I'll define the specification. I think there's something called Clojure spec or something that they keep iterating on to get better. But that's the way my mind works. Is I'll create a compilable spec, and then I'll build an interpreter for that spec, and that usually consists in a proliferation of libraries. So that's what I meant.
Yeah. So no, I'm with you. I guess I haven't had a problem that required serious refactoring tools yet.
Okay.
So yeah. To answer that question about
that's wrong.
Clojure's purpose, I think. Okay,
let's repeat it. Normally, every language has a purpose or is targeted to address some specific type of problems. What would you say Clojure's purpose is? I think I kind of asked that earlier, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think, okay, I'd say, sorry, I missed that. I think I'd say two things. One of them is like, I guess, the official answer. Clojure is really good at transforming and manipulating data of any kind. So it's really, really good at that.
Which is software in general, right?
Yeah, I mean, so that makes it really, really pleasant to use. And for me, the other purpose of Clojure, I think, is to give you a tool that you can keep in your head. because what I find with Clojure is that I don't have to be at my computer to solve the problem. There's actually very few functions, and most functions behave in a similar way. So it's very easy to reason about a problem without being at your keyboard. So it's possible to contain the solution in your head, and that's what I find makes Clojure like really really good. And I think the community as a whole is working to make the tools really sharp and make things really easy to reason about.
That's
So yeah,
that's interesting, and so I have a question about that. So in statically typed functional programming languages, and this is different from like object-oriented programming. So like in Java or C Sharp, and probably Ruby, probably everything, uh, you have to see the implementation details of the method to really, and you have to trace through it to
mm.
understand what that method is doing. But in Haskell or Elm or F Sharp and Scala, I don't need to read or parse through the implementation details. I just need to look at the function signature, and I
Mm.
know what it does. Right? There's
And I
no
think,
side.
but I
How's that
think
work
that's
in Clojure?
but I think that's not a language specific thing. I think that's a like a almost a side effect of functional programming. Because if every function only does one thing, then it's very clear if it's named well what it does.
Well, my question is for statically typed functional programming languages, it's easy to infer what a function is doing by just looking at its signature. In Clojure, is the same thing true? Because Clojure doesn't really have types. So
Yeah,
do you not still have to parse through the implementation to figure out what it's doing?
no, I mean, all you need to know is okay, the function name. Hopefully, it's decent. Then does it take in a collection or not? Um, but generally, that's because the person writes the code in a sensible way. So the argument's name is a call or excess, which is like or something that indicates that it's an array of some sort or a list. Once you have that information, it's pretty straightforward to understand. So I don't find myself looking at implementations actually ever. The
Okay.
only implementation I ever have to look at is when I'm working with the Google SDK. Then I have to go and read through the Java and understand what's what.
Is there such thing as interfaces in Clojure? So
Um,
like
yeah.
interfaces in static FP is function types. And so you can implement a interface in functional programming using a function type. But in Clojure, like, are there interfaces?
Yeah, they are. They
Can you
are.
have contracts like that? What would
Mm.
that look like?
So they are interfaces. So I haven't written many interfaces in my life. Let me just be
Okay.
honest. But
All right.
so I've recently done quite a bit of work on something called conserve. It's like a spec. So they wrote a protocol for how libraries should interact with the data stores. So the compilation fails if you don't abide by that spec in your implementation. And they expect certain functions have to be defined and so forth. So that's kind of similar to like the Java world of interfaces, or what it's more similar to almost like a class in a way.
Well, Clojure spec,
Um,
right?
no, it's not. It's not Clojure spec. So you can define like a protocol. It
Yeah.
basically says, okay,
Okay.
cool.
Yeah, Ramen
This is like
says protocols. Okay.
yeah. So it's like you say, okay, this is my type, and these are the protocols it has to implement, right? And in that type, you can't implement other protocols not specified in it, and the compiler will shout at you if you do otherwise. But apart from that, I think there's very few cases where you actually need that. At least in
That's
my
open to
experience.
interpretation. But then again, you're working in a completely different paradigm than me.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm just not wired to really appreciate what that language provides, such that I don't have to be concerned with that.
Mm. Yeah. So I do see where types help. But I mean, I went from writing Java to JavaScript, which doesn't have types. So then it was like being adrift at sea, and I just became comfortable not having types in my life.
Yeah. Okay. Well, wrapping up, are you
Mm.
still in the conference circuit? Do you still give talks? How active
Well, yeah.
are you? Are you slowing
Well,
down?
I was hoping to be super active this year, and
Okay.
then all the travel just got canned. So,
Oh yeah.
um,
I didn't even consider that when I asked the question.
so I did a CFP for Clojure Dutch Days. I was giving a design talk in Cape Town in May, and I did another design. try and talk online for a thing called She Can Do. But then, I mean, with Corona, yeah, but I'm definitely keen. I find the conference is really cool. It's a really cool way to meet developers and like-minded peeps.
Yeah, well, it sounds like because of this Corona things, there's going to be certain practices that we may keep or find useful, even when this Corona gets resolved. In regards to like conferences, more and more being them online or whatever, or even having someone that is a speaker of a conference, but they decide to stay at home but still deliver a presentation 2,000 miles away to people sitting down in another location. I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, in my view, so we're going to have to find new ways of doing things. 100% agree with you there. But I think the conference almost has two kinds of advantages. Like one of like opening your mind in terms of learning new things and new ways of doing things. And the other is just like meeting people, because there's like I mean, at least personally, I find that I'm very inspired after conference. You know, meeting people who are very,
yeah,
and I haven't
depending on the
found that
conference you go
online yet.
to. Yeah, depending on the conference you go to.
Yeah.
Like if you go to a FP conference, you actually appreciate meeting people that share your interests or are like-minded. But a lot of local conferences that I might attend is very vendor specific. Like they're selling you Azure, they're selling you Xamarin. So you're still interacting with mainstream thought processes. But yeah, I guess it depends on the type of conference that you attend. I want to go to a Clojure conference, and I'm not even a Clojure developer, but
you should. I've met a few people who are just there to like see what Clojure is about and meet the Clojure people. But they're like, yeah, that's it. I'm not going to become a Clojure developer tomorrow.
yeah.
I came, I saw it was cool. Cheers. You know.
I'm gonna have to hit up this Roman guy afterwards. I'm sure he has a lot to offer.
Yeah,
the only reason why I haven't addressed a lot of what he's been saying is because I don't want to lose. I'm very scatterbrained, as you may already know, and so I don't want to like lose context as you're talking. That's the only reason why I didn't acknowledge a lot of things that he was saying as we're talking. That's the only reason. But I'm really interested in talking to him.
Yeah, it seems interesting. Yeah, I'll ping him on Twitter.
Anything else before I wrap up?
No, I think that's all. It's been a good chat.
Yeah, thanks for taking this short notice.
It's a super nice way to, because I just finished work, so it's a really nice way to unwind post work. So thanks.
Where are you? I thought you were in Kenya.
No, I was born in Kenya, but I actually live in South Africa.
Okay.
So our time zone is +2, so it's 5 p.m. here. So the workday just basically ended.
What's the industry like in South Africa? I know it's banking. Or no?
So industry in general or Clojure specifically?
No, I was industries in general in South Africa or in Johannesburg. What is it? What's the capital? Johannesburg?
No, Pretoria is the capital, and it's the greatest city in the world. But Johannesburg is the famous one.
Okay.
So there's a lot of corporates in Johannesburg. Banking, yes. Insurance. There's a lot of financial services. And obviously with that goes a lot of Java and COBOL. But yeah, I mean, it's doing well. I mean, obviously the whole lockdown thing has really hurt our economy. But on the whole, I mean, when I've been to other cities, it's comparable. You know. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Alexander, it's been real. Thanks again for taking this such short notice. I've learned a lot. I don't know when I'm going to transition over. I have a hobby project that I've been working on for over a year now. I don't know when I'm going to get it done, but when I do get it done and it is a failure, I'm going to start learning Clojure.
Okay. So. Or when you get the itch to rewrite it, if it's a success, then pick Clojure.
I thought about rewriting. I thought about writing some new services in Clojure. It's just I have to learn the entire. I think I have to learn the entire ecosystem. So I have to learn. What is it, IntelliJ that Roman had mentioned, which I paid $100 for, and I never used it. I did that like 8 months ago.
I don't use IDEs. I use VS Code and Lanigan. That's it. I'm a huge believer in the free tool stack. So, yeah.
Do Do you have any side gigs mentoring people or teaching people?
Not particularly, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
There also aren't many Clojure developers around, so.
You have a blog page or a technical journal that people can find?
Well, I have a blog. I can send it through.
Okay.
Yeah,
Or go to your Twitter and find it. It's probably there.
yeah, probably.
Yeah.
It's definitely on my GitHub. It's on my GitHub.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's been real. So
Thank
if
you.
there's nothing else you have to say or ask, I'm about to terminate this broadcast.
That's all. Thank you for having me.
Hey, cool. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
And I'm hitting end right now.